we have all experienced what I'm about to describe. The sense of awe and excitement when we finally get to somewhere we've long dreamt of visiting, seeing the sun rise over Stonehenge, walking along part of Hadrian's Wall, watching the captain of your team climb the steps to pick up a trophy at Wembley Stadium. You have long known that these places exist, but when you actually get there yourself and drink in the sights, it can be almost overwhelming. Now, travel back in time with me. Jesus and his disciples are in Jerusalem. For 1,000 years, this has been the national capital and, while the nation had a king, the royal city. For almost as long, it has had a temple, the one place in the world where heaven and earth touch, the Lord's holy temple. And it was truly a remarkable building. In size, it could not match the great pyramids of Egypt, but its location on a hilltop plateau meant it overlooked the entire city without itself being overlooked. And it was in itself a work of beauty. King Herod had spared no expense in cladding it with white marble and finishing it with gold. When the sun was out, the building was literally dazzling. Herod intended it to take your breath away, and it did. We can understand the disciples' excitement as they pointed out to Jesus. Mark 13, 1 and 2 in the Message Bible. As he walked away from the temple, one of his disciples said, "Teacher, look at that stonework, those buildings." Jesus said, "You're impressed by this grandiose architecture. There's not a stone in the whole works that is not going to end up in a heap of rubble." If we heard someone talking like that outside the Houses of Parliament, we might think a terrorist plot was being hatched. And when we remember the time of year, Passover, when the Jewish people celebrated how God had rescued them from foreign oppression in Egypt, this was a particularly incendiary statement. Which is why, a little while later, the inner ring of disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, had a quiet word with Jesus. They were now on the Mount of Olives, so with a good view of the city, with the temple being visible above the city walls. So they asked, when will this happen? Note that they do not doubt what Jesus has told them. They know that this can happen, and if Jesus says it will happen, then it's going to happen. But when? Jesus gives a somewhat cryptic answer. Mark 13, verses 5 to 8 in Tom Wright's New Testament for Everyone. "Take care that nobody deceives you," Jesus began to say to them. "Plenty of people will come in my name, saying, 'I'm the one,' and they will lead plenty astray. But whenever you hear about wars and rumours about wars, don't be disturbed. These things have to happen, but it doesn't mean the end is here. One nation will rise up against another. One kingdom will rise up against another. There will be earthquakes from place to place, and famines too. These are the first pains of childbirth." Wars and rumours of wars is a well-known phrase, almost proverbial in modern English. Although when Jesus said this, almost 2,000 years ago, the famed Pax Romana, Roman peace, meant that there had been no real wars within the empire since the civil war between Augustus and Mark Antony ended 50 years previously. Any Roman wars were beyond the boundaries of the empire, particularly in what we today call Germany, the territories east of the Rhine. Sometimes it took a long time for news to get back to Rome. In the year 9, the Roman general Publius Quintilius Varus led 3 Roman legions over the Rhine to pacify the German tribes. And nothing more was heard of Varus and his legions. No satellite communications, no homing pigeons, no survivors. total silence after the total annihilation of the three legions. Just rumours trickling back about the disaster, if you were Roman, or the great victory, if you were German. But these actual wars, or rumours of wars, whenever the news filtered through, were not signs that the end was nigh. And in the context of this discussion, the end of the Jewish temple was the subject in hand. Likewise, earthquakes. Then, as now, the eastern end of the Mediterranean suffered from occasional and sometimes catastrophic earthquakes. But one disaster does not mean that the end was coming. And then Jesus uses the phrase archeudin, beginnings of pangs or spasms, which most English Bibles rightly give as the first pains of childbirth or something similar. This was just the start. In the ancient world, giving birth was just about the most dangerous thing any woman could do. Even today, with all our medical technology, I am reliably informed that childbirth, while no longer as dangerous as it was and still is in many parts of the world, is or can be very painful, so I'm told. However, the illustration is vivid and understandable. Even though Jesus was speaking to four men, he could be sure that they would get the point. Something is coming and they need to be ready. And note, this is a warning for four men sitting on the Mount of Olives outside Jerusalem in the spring of the year 33. All this was relevant to them, assuming they were in their 20s or 30s, and it is an assumption, and some of them may have been older. But for the sake of the argument, let us say they were as old as the century, so 33 or thereabouts. Then, as now, if you survived childhood, most people had a reasonable expectation of making their 70 years and 10 or 70, and it was not unknown for people to make it to 100. So in the year 33, four men were told these things would happen within their lifetime. Let us say they all do indeed make it to 70. That means these cataclysmic events were going to be over well before the year 100, and quite probably sooner. Jesus is not talking about the end of time. These things happened within the first generation of the Christian church. And remember the context. Jesus is talking about the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And then Jesus gets personal, speaking, you remember, to his four closest followers, Peter, James, John, and Andrew. Mark 13, verses 9 to 14. But watch out for yourselves. They will hand you over to courts. They will beat you in synagogues. You will stand before rulers and kings because of me as a witness against them. And the message of the kingdom must first be announced to all the nations. And when they put you on trial and hand you over, don't work out beforehand what you're going to say, but say whatever is given you at that moment. It won't be you speaking, you see, but the Holy Spirit. One brother will hand over another to death. Fathers will hand over children. Children will rebel against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by everyone because of my name. But the one who is patient through to the end, that one will be saved. Regardless of what was or was not going to happen to Jerusalem and its temple, Jesus warns his followers that they were going to get caught up in the tumultuous events that were on their way. Followers of Jesus were going to be put on trial. Read the book of Acts to see this happening. Things were going to be particularly bad for Christians from a Jewish heritage. They will be beaten in the synagogues and families were going to be ripped apart. And you will be hated by everyone because of my name. Perhaps you remember what Jesus had said about his followers being called to take up our cross. Well, these early disciples certainly had it tough. Within a generation, Christianity faced an all-out attack from the Roman authorities, with the Emperor Nero leading the way. And these horrors were unleashed on Christians before the Jewish war that led to the destruction of the temple. Perhaps these were the birth pangs. And then came the catastrophe of the Jewish rebellion that led to the end of the temple and sacrificial Judaism. But the one who is patient through to the end, that one will be saved. Many Christians died in first century persecutions, but the church remained. As the Latin writer Tertullian later stated, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. The more Christians were killed, the more others decided that this was a faith worth having and a saviour worth loving. So the Jerusalem temple fell. Later, the Roman Empire fell. Nations have come and gone. Eventually, even the British Empire will be no more. But the church remains because the word remains. And above all, Jesus continues to reign, not as a political leader here on earth, but as a saviour, one who lives within his followers, and when we gather together within the community of faith that we call the church. So who needs a temple anyway? We have something infinitely greater. His name is Jesus. As Jesus continues his warnings in Mark 13, his language changes. He starts to use the visionary vocabulary that some of the prophets of the old times used, almost picture language that the disciples and any Jew who knew his or her scriptures would understand, but which sounds strange to us, which can lead to misunderstanding. But this is what I think. I'm going to continue reading Mark chapter 13, picking up at verse 14, but I'm switching to the more traditional English Standard Version, and we'll stop to add in some explanation as we go. This is Jesus speaking, remember, Mark 13:14. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. What, you may well ask, is an abomination of desolation? The monster of desecration in some other translations. Belgima hoerimos in Greek, if that helps. Whatever it is, it's going to stand where it should not. And note that Mark, let the reader understand, seems to mean that it's really important, but that he has to be careful about what he says. With this warning, Jesus seems to be telling his disciples that history is going to repeat itself. He is probably remembering the dreadful time in what we call the year 156 BC, for December of that year to be precise, when the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes, who ruled Judah at the time, decided to outlaw the Jewish faith and had a pagan altar built in the temple where pigs were sacrificed. So abomination of desolation or monster of desecration would describe the situation well. Antiochus was eventually driven out by Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, but Jesus seems to be warning that something similar was going to happen again, and when it did, the people would be well advised to flee to the mountains. This sounds like Ezekiel chapter 12, where the prophet reminds the people about what had happened when the mighty Babylonian army descended on Jerusalem. Ezekiel 12:16 says, "And if any survivors escape, they will be on the mountains, like doves of the valleys, all of them moaning, each one over his iniquity." Heading to the hills was what you did when an enemy invaded. It was the ancient equivalent of running to the air raid shelter when you heard the siren. About 25 years before Jesus said these things outside Jerusalem, the Roman army had marched through Galilee, besieging towns to put down an uprising after the death of King Herod. Jesus knew that something similar was to happen again, but much, much worse than the disturbances following the death of Herod. Next time it was going to be Jerusalem under attack, not just the outlying province of Galilee. And next time history was going to repeat itself, and even the Holy Temple would not be spared. It was going to be grim. Read on in Mark 13, verses 15 to 23, still Jesus speaking. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as not been seen from the beginning of creation that God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. Jesus is making it very clear. When you see the enemy coming, get out of town. In the years before the next Roman invasion, in what we call AD 70, there were indeed false messiahs, each claiming to be the chosen one of God. Some seemed to be able to perform miraculous signs, but they were fakes. Run away, fast. And now the description becomes more outlandish, at least to our way of thinking. Mark 13, verses 24 to 27, still Jesus speaking, remember. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. We cannot read this as being a literal description. I mean, how exactly do stars fall, and what do they fall onto? This is not a weather forecast, it is poetry. Jesus is using what is known as apocalyptic language. His original hearers were familiar with this and could decode it. For us, it sounds strange, although we do sometimes use non-literal language ourselves. The government has been shaken to its foundations. The city is in meltdown. That sort of language. No, there's not been an earthquake in Westminster and a volcano in the City of London. It is figurative language expressing a dramatic shock to the system. So Jesus is using a poetic way of speaking to emphasize just how drastic the coming events were going to be and how no one could miss them. Read on. Mark 13, verses 28 to 31. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. We can all see and understand the signs around us as the seasons change. Blossom on the trees, the first swallows returning from wherever they've spent the winter. Summer is a-coming. The leaves turning brown in autumn, telling us that winter is near. And round we go again to the next year. And now Jesus gives a stark warning. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. This generation must mean the people listening to Jesus. All this is going to happen in their lifetime. Given that Jesus is speaking to grown men in the year 33, and if we assume at least some of them live to be 80, then these events will have happened well before the end of the first century. Jesus is not warning about the end of the world. This is a warning that something remarkable, devastating, the end of an era is coming, and coming soon, within the lifetime of the disciples who were listening to him. And to emphasize this, Jesus promises that his words will last longer than time itself. But he is not going to be specific. The disciples need to stay alert. So we reach verse 32. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey, when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the cock crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. So, I believe that these warnings were given to a group of people who were going to live to see them fulfilled. This happened when the extremist zealots led a rebellion against the Roman Empire in the year 68. It took Rome time to respond, but once General Vespasian had organized his troops, the legions rolled in from Syria, crushed resistance in Galilee, and then moved south to Jerusalem. The remaining Christians in the city saw what was happening, remembered what Jesus had said, and left. And the Jews never forgave them. The remaining Jerusalemite Jews fought to the death, but the city fell and the temple was destroyed. Jesus knew what he was talking about. So, if my understanding is correct, this passage is of historical interest, but says nothing about how the world will end. Not that we need to know. But the world will end, of that I am sure. More likely, our own end will come first. Whichever it is, the warning remains unchanged. We all need to be ready. So stay awake.